Do you all feel the New Orleans love in that small clap ovation? Have you felt it since we've been here? It's my pleasure to be your moderator today. My name is Lucy Bustamante. I am a journalist of 20-something years now, and the latest professional endeavor is morning anchor at our local Fox station here, WVUE, and previously, 14 years ago at WWL, in between NBC News and the ABC station in Virginia Beach, as we left as a result of military service, and here we are, we're back. The three people to my right are people that I've known since I was literally a teenager trying to learn the business. And
make us feel old, Lucy. What?
No. We have all aged together, my friend. And truly, the thing about this market is that we value what's real so deeply that I'm very blessed to have learned the skill in this city. And I met Jarvis when I was at a press conference as an intern in St. Aug. And he told me, I really want you to understand why it's important that these boys got a high school education here as opposed to another all-boys Catholic school in New Orleans. And I was like, what does he mean by that? That was 19-year-old self, and here I am as a 44-year-old. Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Miss Cheryl, you have photographed every up and down of this city, every dance, every funeral. You have been everywhere all the time with that super unassuming, beautiful smile. This is how she's shown up to crime scenes. This is how she's shown up to Super Bowls. This is how she has shown up very subtly, professionally, and photographed our story. This is who we have here with Cheryl Gerber.
Thank you.
Jeff Duncan, the accidental news reporter during Hurricane Katrina, preferred to stay in sports. And you wrote this incredible book, Bags to Riches, which we all could experience the healing through the football story that was the Saints right after Katrina. And I'll start with that. I'll start with you. You've covered so much. This is not your first book. Talk about, now that Drew Brees is also an older 40-year-old retired player, we went through so much during those years. What was it that was so important to you to make sure that you captured in a book so that 20 years later, the kids could read and find?
Well, I think it's important to kind of go back to that time, right? I mean, the Katrina year right after the storm, if you all remember, if you came back, I mean, it was a difficult time in this city. You didn't so much lived here, you endured here, right? Those early months after the storm. And we were looking for any type of outlet from the drudgery of daily life. And sports was certainly one of those things. The Saints were one of not only the largest maybe entertainment vehicle in the city, but also I think a talisman of the old way of life in New Orleans that we all feared, frankly, might not come back. I think there was some genuine concerns and fears that the New Orleans we all loved pre-Katrina wasn't going to come back after the storm. So we grasped on to anything from our old lives and pulled it forwards. Any reopening, I remember giving out like copies of the Times-Picayune during the storm coverage, and people were crying and holding on to the Times-Picayune because it was a local product. So anything like that really carried resonance, and I think the Saints embodied that more so than any professional sports team I know. The fact that the Saints wear the city's logo on the side of their helmet, that is unusual. It's not like that in most professional sports teams. So I think the team transcended just the normal rah-rah, let's root for this football team. I think people saw in that team themselves, or at least a representative of themselves, and it gave them a source of pride after the storm when we didn't have a lot of things to be proud of after the storm. And so what you saw was this kind of civic, symbiotic relationship. And I know nationally, a lot of my colleagues that came to town were writing the story as the Saints went on this magical run in 2006, very surprising run. that the city was lifting the team, or the team was lifting the city, rather. That was the national narrative, right? Drew Brees and Sean Payton are lifting the city, and no doubt they were. There's no doubt that that was a huge part of it. But somewhere along the line, I think it inverted, probably when the team was coming home from road games and finding hundreds of people at the airport, lining the side of Atlantic Aviation, welcoming back a pro football team. That's something you would see in small town Texas high school football, not at the professional level. And I think it resonated with the players, a lot of them who weren't here before Katrina. That was a largely new team. They recognized quickly this was way bigger than us, way bigger than just a football team trying to win a division championship. And I think it took on a life of its own.
I'm going to go back to you after we go to Cheryl's opening. I want you to talk deeply about the relationship that you saw Gleason, Peyton, and them in turn form with us. And just wait, that's a tease for you. Good stuff there. Cheryl, we'll go to you. The thing about Cheryl's photography is that there are certain photographers that just capture it. They just, oh my God, she got the shot. How do you know, how do you feel, and how did you protect yourself during that really hard time?
Well, I was working during Katrina for the most part. Coming back, I had to leave for a little while and get an RV to come back to the city. And when you walk around the city that you have photographed for the, up to that point I had been photographing New Orleans 20 years, the culture, the vibrance, the resilience. And to see those mud-covered streets with nothing. And there was one particular photograph. I was driving around, nobody was in town yet, and I was driving around the 8th Ward. And there was a black masking Indian headdress out on the porch hanging. It was Wild Man Loco, and it said, "I'll be back." And I just started crying because, I just thought everything that I had photographed for 20 years was gone forever. And then every time, like he said, anything happened, anything opened, it became like this celebratory event. And so the urgency to photograph more became, part of what I had to do. And it was, people don't understand that Katrina, for us, lasted literally 10 years. I mean, I remember it was 2 years after the storm that I got my first non-Katrina assignment, and it was for GQ magazine following bounty hunters. And there was this German reporter who, we went and picked up a fugitive, like a 19-year-old fugitive, and he's sitting in the back of the car with me and this reporter in the middle, and the reporter's trying to ask him questions about his crimes, and he's like shutting down, he's not talking. But then the bounty hunters start talking about Katrina. It's been 2 years. For us, it was like yesterday. And we were going down South Broad toward OPP, and one of the bounty hunters pointed out the water line on his favorite barber's shop. And then the fugitive young man started chiming in about his experience, and we all started talking about it. And this reporter says, "Excuse me, you people act like this happened yesterday." And I just remember, when when you're not on the news, it goes away. So for me, it's just always been telling all the stories about New Orleans and putting, my photography is deeply rooted in the dichotomies that exist here. My last book, The Danse Macabre, talks about celebration and survival in a city where death during the pandemic, during hurricanes, all of that is so huge here. So I try to show the different sides, the differences between black and white people in New Orleans, the difference between rich and poor, gay and straight, and that's pretty much what I do. And I've done 3 books since Katrina that all revolve around the diversity and dichotomies of New Orleans. Resilience is a word that a lot of New Orleanians are really starting to hate. because we have been way too resilient. So recently, and I have a whole chapter in this last book on the defiance of New Orleans. The defiance in this city is so deeply rooted that, you know, it's everywhere you look, in the culture of the baby dolls, of the black masking Indians, in the boycott Super Bowl, you know. I mean, you know, we take to the streets, and I expect that pretty soon we will start taking to the streets again. You know?
Jarvis, I asked a few people, what would you want to hear from Jarvis DeBerry? And I remember being 20-something, and my first text message ever was telling my friend from our news helicopter, I'm so sorry your house is underwater. First text message ever. And somebody told me, what would be the first tweet that Jarvis DeBerry would have put out there had we had social media during Katrina? Because remember, it came out next year.
I really don't have to imagine that, even though there was no Twitter yet. We were doing a blog at the Times-Picayune. And so a bunch of us went out that Monday afternoon when the wind died down. We were on the newspaper delivery trucks, and we were deployed around the city. Well, that's what we thought we were, because we couldn't go that far into the city. We got as far as the high rise, and it was underwater, and so we came back. And so when I made it, so we were all being told to do these very, very short blog posts. And so I remember verbatim the post that I made when I got back. It said, the service station at Franklin Avenue and the interstate is completely underwater. Send. And I figured that if you knew where that particular service station is, and you knew anything about the city, and if you lived anywhere in that vicinity, that would tell you everything that you needed to know. So, and so I don't have to imagine. That's short enough to have been in a tweet.
Yeah.
But if I were sitting and thinking a little bit longer about what I would have tweeted, it would depend on the day. Probably that Monday would just be, oh my God, you know, what is happening? You know, it is happening. I'll tell you, and this would be far too long for a tweet, one of my enduring memories of that day is when we were being deployed out to the east. Ironically, maybe ironically is the wrong word, but there was a truck ahead of ours that was being sent out to St. Bernard to see what they could find there. And we left about 5 minutes later on our delivery truck. And as we were coming around the curve on the interstate, we see that first truck coming back. And the driver explains to us that the interstate is completely underwater at the high rise. But we do go a little further. Gwen Filosa was my colleague there. I think she and I were on that same truck. We got out of the truck onto the high rise, look over, and I see people clinging onto things to try to stay afloat. Yeah. There are people in boats. There's this man, you know, like the big orange cylindrical water cooler that you'll see in like baseball dugouts. He has his arms thrown across that, trying to stay afloat. People are yelling up to us to tell us that there's a house somewhere in the vicinity where I think a dozen people, including a pregnant woman, were trapped. And so that's one of my like lingering memories of that. But I will tell you that about 2 years ago, there was a British documentary crew here interviewing me about Katrina. And I told that story as I had been telling for, 17 years at that point. And I got halfway through it and I could not continue. My voice broke. The tears began to flow. And I realized perhaps for the first time at that moment, I don't know if the people I saw that day survived.
Wow.
And I don't know if I was witnessing their final moments or not. And so it took like about 17 years for that reality to like grab me by the throat in the retelling. So I guess the length of this answer tells me that I probably couldn't have put anything in a tweet. But yeah, it was an experience for all of us who were here.
Let me pause there.
Just to see that
Thank you
stuff.
for letting us in. Thank you for letting us in. That's deep. And it took months to get rid of the initial nightmares. It took months.
If you got rid of them.
We exist in this space together that has no calendar. It's as if I just saw you again. The last time I saw you was somewhere covering something 20 years ago, and I hugged you as if I saw you yesterday. See Jeff at work from time to time when he comes on, and as if it's yesterday. This is transcendental. We are bonded by our survival. You have since become a dad. You have a new kidney.
Yes.
Your daughter wrote a book saying, "My dad needs a kidney."
Yes.
Before we move on to the rest, now that we have all this life that we've lived in the in-between, how do you do the fast paragraph now when people still think it was a God moment and not a man-made disaster? What do you say now? What's the short?
Things shouldn't fall apart that way. I remember saying that when the interstate bridge collapsed in Minneapolis. I don't remember how many years that was after Katrina, but I remember saying in the same way that that bridge should not have collapsed, the levees around New Orleans should not have collapsed.
Yeah.
And I think people just need to understand that in just such simple terms. This was an engineering failure, and know that people were not stupid to live here.
Thank you. Cheryl, I want to go back to you because you've been a photographer way before everybody else was with our phones, right? And I want to know the evolution of your craft in the last 20 years. How are kids processing now,
Yeah.
the 20 years, like this story? It's like, oh yeah, my mom took me to wherever, and then they're on their phones
I
again.
know it's
right?
it's really hard to photograph things these days because everybody has an iPhone. I mean, if you remember, August 29th, 2005 was not just the anniversary of Katrina. It's the anniversary of learning how to text, because I did not know how to text, and I received a text and was like, how did that happen? And so there were times, I mean, you had to go to the dark room, you had to do all of that. And now, I don't get angry about the evolution of the iPhone, and it's just part of the landscape. I incorporate that into the photographs. One thing that's happened since Katrina is, especially in the cultural community, they are being adored now like they have never been adored. Everybody wants a picture, and we did a panel about the ethics of crossing lines this morning on that, but I'm not going to talk about that. But there's just so much that could be lost, and you're talking about the man-made disaster. Because I had to go out there all the time and photograph the levee breaches and the helicopters dropping sand. And there were a few people in our community that were not going to rest, like Sandy Rosenthal, who was not going to let the government off the hook. And I remember my first book, New Orleans, Life and Death in the Big Easy, came out for the 10th anniversary of Katrina, because by then it was largely wrapped up. Not everything was picked up, but the city said we're going to move on from here. And one of the pictures that I used photo juxtaposition to show how we're alike and how we're different. I used one photo of a black masking Indian, Walter Cook, wrapped in an American flag 2 or 3 years after Katrina, still hadn't been able to come home yet. And then there was a woman on the levee with the Army Corps of Engineers at that breach at the 17th Street Canal, waving her American flag, protesting, just this little tiny woman with her flag surrounded by all the workers. Wow. And I just wanted to show people that defiance, we're not going to just lay down and take it. So.
Yeah. Jeff, talk about this young man that started off as one of the heroes boy, do we love the people who moved here right after.
Right.
I mean, we have a special affection for the people who moved here right after to be part of our fabric. Talk about them, Peyton, Breeze, Gleason.
Well, yeah, that's a great point, because I think I can remember early on as a news reporter, right? We were all news reporters, Jarvis, Cheryl, after Katrina. I'm a sports reporter out trying to cover the biggest story of our lives. I remember driving down Chalpatulas and seeing a billowing black smoke, and this was the days right after the storm, and thinking, that looks like a fire over there. Maybe I need to go drive over and cover it. And it's me and Brett Anderson, who's one of my good friends at the paper, was our food critic at the time. And we're driving over to this fire, having absolutely no idea what we're doing, right? I'm walking around the perimeter of the fire, looking for like a PR person to tell me what the score is. Who's winning? Is the fire winning or are we winning? And I'm a sports writer, right? There's always a score. It was chaos. It was complete chaos. The food writer trying to talk to a guy with the fire hose. That's what it was like, right? I mean, it was just all hands on deck covering this. But in those initial days, when people started trickling back into the city, and I'm sure a lot of you all were a part of that ingress, you realized how difficult it was going to be, right? The recovery. And a lot of people chose, understandably, to not come back because it was going to be hard. The people that did come back, I found to be incredibly, to use the word resilient, but defiant, but also very much invested in the city, right? If you came back, you weren't a fence sitter anymore, right? You were emotionally, financially, spiritually invested in this place recovering. Yeah. So when we got anybody new to come in, like you said, Drew Brees, who chose to come here, right? He could have gone to Miami. Yep. He picked New Orleans. Sean Payton picked New Orleans. So we immediately vaulted them into exalted status, I think, because they chose us. No one was choosing us. Sean Payton has that line, when he was driving into the city, there were a lot more cars driving out back when he came in. And I think that time also we had a dearth of leadership, at least competent leadership. I actually thought Mayor Ray Nagin, during the crisis, I thought was a very strong leader. If you can remember him yelling, "Get off your goddamn asses and get some," right? I mean,
pardon my French, everybody in America.
Yes. I mean, and the best one of all was General Honore, who came in. We were dying for strong leadership, right? And when everyone left, we were looking for anybody, and I think Sean and Drew embodied that. They were not only strong leaders, they were competent, and then we just had this miraculous season. I mean, I don't know if you remember that first year, but the Saints couldn't play any home games. They couldn't practice here because the dome was being, renovated and refurbished. They had to push the season back. The first home game was week 3 because it needed more time for the dome to be renovated. That's such a massive project. Training camp was in Jackson. The preseason games were in Jackson and Shreveport. So the anticipation building up to that first season, if you remember, the dome had like a sign on the side, like a countdown calendar, like it was the holidays for the opening game. And everyone that drove by the Superdome saw that countdown. So the buildup and the anticipation for that first game. But that preseason, Lucy, the team went 0-5. They were awful. No one saw 2006 coming. And so to see that team come together the way it did, and how many people were at the opening game? of the Duncan. It was magical, wasn't it? I mean, it was so far beyond a football game that night. It transcended sports, and I just think it took off from there. And Drew and Sean and Steve Gleason, who blocked the punt, I think they all understood that. They understood that they were representing something bigger, and it takes that. You have to have people that get it, and they got it.
And they continue representing, even if they live here or not. It's a really, really interesting bond. It's deep, and they keep those connections. Living away, whenever we do see each other at New Orleans things, it's like,
Yeah.
And, once again, it transcends professional relationships. Everything was personal. The last live shot that I did before the storm rolled in was standing in front of the dome telling people to come here if they had nowhere else to go. And it was like, man, that was like the first lesson of, should we have questioned authority more? Like, should we have said, no, not here, more buses, more people out, what did you question? What was could I have impacted this differently had I wrote this instead, announced this instead, reported this live instead? Did you go through any of that, Jarvis?
I don't think before the storm, and again, we weren't anticipating the engineering failures that happened. I think a lot about kind of some of the initial things that we wrote after Katrina, but I'm pretty much proud of all of it, honestly. I think that the Times-Picayune did heroic work. I see my former editor, Terry Troncalli, over to my right. I hope this isn't sharing a little too much, but that Saturday after the storm, we are, I think, at LSU at that point, and the Bush administration is giving this litany of excuses for why they hadn't done more, why they couldn't do more, and Terry comes and says, "I'm too mad to write, but I'm calling bullshit." And so they say they can't do this, they say they can't do this, they say they can't do that. Bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. Can you write that? And I said, I'll try. And so what you saw on that Sunday was an editorial with the headline, "Dear Mr. President," that was written directly to George W. Bush, saying that there is no excuse for what has happened. And I remember seeing the Chiron on CNN that next morning, rolling across the screen. Times-Picayune, an angry editorial to the president says ... And again, I don't really try to second guess the things that we said and wrote then. I think all of us were dealing with the best information that we had, but the anger that we had was righteous and true. And I am happy that we got a chance to express it. And on behalf of people, on behalf of the people that we loved and on the city that we loved.
I'm going to follow up. I want to follow up with how did covering that event, form your process for the rest of your journalism career? Was that the first time that you went from straight reporting to editorial?
No, I was an editorial writer before then, but to Jeff's point, we had the unlikeliest characters at the Times-Picayune reporting on the city. Terry was there as an editorial page editor, Doug McCash, the art critic, Bruce Nolan, the religion writer, Brett Anderson, the food critic, Jeff Duncan, the sports reporter. It all happened to be if you were on a particular truck, it was that truck that turned back around, came back into the city, and the people on that truck, whoever they were, whatever their beats were the ones who reported. So I was already writing editorials, but like everybody else, stepped into a reporter's role for at least a week or two. So there were really no assignments, beats, roles. We were all assigned to telling, as Jeff just put it, the biggest story. I see Gordon Russell sitting there. I want to call him out too, as one of the more heroic journalists in the city at that time.
Cheryl, talk about the memory that lives with you the deepest.
The biggest memory for me was I was stationed on Canal Street. The New York Times was nice enough to put me in the Ritz-Carlton. And the day that the storm passed, I looked out. Some bricks were falling, it looked like some trash. I went out and photographed the fallen trees, the bricks, the signs. And then I get a text from the New York Times, or an email, saying, try to get people on rooftops. And I'm like, what? I mean, at that point, I had to use WWL-TV's generators to send the photographs. And I think so many of us were so complacent. If you were about my age when the storm hit, you'd never really experienced a big one, and you never thought it would really be like that. But the one image that stays out in my mind was the Ritz-Carlton told us we could not go out during the storm, not even like to the garage. And I wanted to photograph the wind. So I was out in the parking garage, protected from the winds, and this horizontal rain and just torrents of water are coming down the street with flotsam. And I'm looking through my lens, and all of a sudden, this man, during the height of the storm, is running into my frame. A tall, skinny African-American man wearing all like blue raincoats, weather gear. And I was like, where are you coming from? And he said, the Ninth Ward. He said the water was rising so fast, he was in the upper Ninth Ward, that he ran all the way there. And that image still haunts me because the Ritz-Carlton caught us out there and made us go back into the hotel, and they wouldn't let the man in.
Wow.
And I just always wondered what happened to him. He was not a young man, but it's so many haunting images like that. And it wasn't until the next day, woke up after photographing the whole day of not much happening. There was a lot. There were the cars, all the windows were sucked out of the cars. There were dead birds on the trees. But, the Superdome was still intact, even though it had a hole in the roof, and St. Louis Cathedral was still intact. So I still was thinking it was okay. Yeah. And then when I was at WWL, I heard one of the reporters screaming, the National Guard's ordering 2,000 body bags.
That's right.
And that's when I knew that it was really, really bad.
Yeah, I was going to say, I remember our crew, Terry is a part of it, early on. We kind of bivouacked back over here early on at one of our colleagues' friends' houses right near Audubon Park. And we're just kind of, like Jarvis said, you really didn't have an assignment. Your assignment was just go out and find a story. They were everywhere. You were tripping over stories at that time. It was just an amazing time. But I distinctly remember we had no running water, right? There was no electricity. So it was difficult conditions to report in. We had nowhere to take baths, and I remember we found, because all the pools all along Audubon Park, we were kind of exploring for a pool to take a bath in, but they were all filled with leaves and branches and tannin. They were brown and black, but there was one pool we found that had the old school chlorine floating dispensers that were on a timer. And that ended up saving the day, because it was old school. It actually cleaned the water. And we took baths in that backyard of that pool. I'm afraid to go knock on their door. I'm afraid they're going to sue us retroactively because we were definitely trespassing. But it was the greatest feeling in the world, dipping into that water after a long day of reporting. Yeah. Because it was hot. If you remember, after the storm, it was hot. It was really difficult. And then we ended up transferring over to Stephanie Grace, our colleague's house on Laurel Street. She made the big mistake of opening her house to us. Uh-oh. It was like Animal House. So there's like 8 guys in this place. Every day we go out, we come back, and I'll never forget well, there's 2 memories if I have time. Do I have time?
Of course, go ahead.
One's driving down Laurel to Harrah's, Caesars. That was like the nerve center at the time of the search and rescue missions.
That's right.
Tim Bayard, with NOPD was kind of running the show, and you'd go down there and show up, and he'd send you out on a search and rescue mission in a boat. You know, again, I'm a sports writer. I'm out doing this stuff, but I remember driving down Laurel Street, and you remember back then everything was kind of brown. There was kind of this haze over the city at the time, and out of the corner of my eye, as I was driving down Laurel, I saw one of these neon yellow, like, estate sale, yard sale signs, right? It stood out in the gray haze, and I looked over on the porch of this double on Laurel Street in Uptown, which was dry, did not flood, and there was a wrapped up body laying on a chair, on a bench actually, and I thought, that can't be a dead body, right? It was wrapped in blankets and had flowers, and there was a biblical passage written on this sign. And I'll never forget the name. Alcee Jackson lies here with this biblical passage that had been written by a local pastor. Find out later the gentleman had passed away, didn't have the right medical needs, and couldn't make it. That body, we reported to the National Guard that night. It sat on that porch for 13 days.
Yep, forever.
A dead body in a major metropolitan area.
Yep.
The National Guard couldn't move the body. They were not allowed through government bureaucracy. Right. It was maddening. I don't think we're ever going to experience anything like this. I hope not.
God, no.
In American history. But I think about that a lot. Like Cheryl says, you're haunted by. I think about what was that like, that moment like, where his spouse had to call the pastor to read the last rites in this chaos that we were all trying to endure.
Oh, I mean, that's exactly
Yes.
it. I remember that they turned the casino into the command center.
Correct.
And I remember the Angola prison warden coming down on day 10 and chain linking the Amtrak train station and turning it into our first jail 10 days after the storm. The bodies were just people you walk by.
Yep.
And here we are, 20 years later, and we have 7 minutes and 35 seconds left, and I always try to respect my producers and the schedule here, but we're raising kids here now. So what do you hope continues to change for the better? What systems haven't changed enough? It's weird coming back after 15 years. When I left, there was only one charter school. I come back and there's one that isn't. Like, what happened? So tell me about the systems that you think that our 20-somethings now need to focus on, Jarvis, so that they don't repeat these horrific moments that still haunt us.
That's a hard one. I would say the eradication of poverty has to be the chief policy initiative, I think, that anybody worth holding office in New Orleans or Louisiana must address. Poverty would not necessarily have kept everybody alive, or the eradication of poverty would not have, but clearly the amount of desperately poor people who inhabited and still inhabit New Orleans played a huge part in the death toll and the inability to come back to the city that they love. So you can't have the New Orleans that we love. Because before the storm, it was relatively, or at least it was easier for poor people to live in New Orleans. After that, it became nigh impossible. And so to me, that is the policy goal, and every other policy ought to fall beneath that.
Cheryl.
So, I mean, the city's a much smaller city, and it is way more expensive. I said, I sometimes say that I've been photographing the same newsreel for 35, 40 years. We still have crime, we still have poverty, we still have racism. But the one thing that changed are the prices. Like, we used to put up with all of those things because it was cheap to live here. but it's not anymore. And I definitely see it in my photography. You don't see the same people here. And the people who do come and enjoy the culture are coming from the suburbs or from Houston or from wherever. It's not the same. And I often think about, I had to do, I photographed Trombone Shorty and his family for Gambit one year. I forgot which year it was. He was about 9 or 10 years old. And we did it on a stoop in Treme. 25 years later, Gambit asked me if I could recreate that shoot with where they are today. It was Glenn David Andrews, James Andrews, Shorty, and one of their other cousins. First of all, I had a hard time finding the stoop that we sat on because everything is a renovated Airbnb now.
Wow.
So, and they had, so I staked the place and I was getting ready. It was starting to rain and Shorty was late. And I was just, thinking like, first of all, trying to get them all in the same city together at the same time was such a nightmare. But there were people in the Airbnb who saw all these black people sitting on their stoop and they would not come outside. It was really weird.
Wow.
So I'm sitting there and I'm waiting for Shorty, and I got to tell you, I see this hot rod Porsche, white Porsche, coming down the street, and I'm remembering the day that I photographed him when he was just this young kid. Everybody knew he had talent, but we did not know that he would become Trombone Shorty. So we redid the shoot. But, Treme is a tragedy of Katrina. There are no African-American people left there. I mean, there are, but not, it's all Airbnbs. And the really bad thing that I see when I go through these neighborhoods is because of the Airbnbs, a lot of people bought these whole houses. The rules changed. Now they're boarded up. Houses are sitting boarded up, and homeless people are sleeping in front of them. And it's just, these are the dichotomies that keep me going, and I just want to point them out all the time.
Can I just add something about that? Talking to Jerome Big Duck Smith a few years ago, he said very briefly, in this Treme, there won't be no more Trombone Shorties.
That's right.
Wow.
That's exactly right.
Wow. Jeff, I'm going to remind you of something before I get your answer. When they announced Kellen Moore, one of the things that I remembered when they said, he's religious, he belongs to Church of Latter-day Saints. And I remember in the first year of Katrina, we all of a sudden had 30,000 Mormon students descend upon the city of New Orleans and go into the lower ninth and go into all the places that we kind of had to tell national media, that's not how you pronounce that street name. Right. And these kids knew that it was Carondelet and Burgundy, and they lived it. It was their mission year. Do you think that there's a new sense of hope now with Kellen? Are we in a new wave for the team? Are we in a new energy? Are we in a new, what are you thinking here? Or is it so polar opposite of where we were back then? Is that one of the systems, our sports scene, that actually cannot be taken back to where we were?
You want me to be honest?
Of course.
Yeah. I'm hopeful myself.
Yeah.
I hope we can get back to that, kind of cathartic period we had. It'd be nice to win some games again, right? But I don't know. It's difficult. I think the further we get from the Drew Brees, Sean Payton era, the more we appreciate the work they did, the leadership they brought.
Yep.
How difficult it is to take a small market like New Orleans with the infrastructure lacking, the Dallases, the New Yorks, and to raise that standard to the level they did. It's extraordinary what was accomplished here. And I don't know if we can get back to that level. It's a big job. It takes somebody very special. But I would say this, I'll leave you with some hope with this. I think Sean Payton will be back here coaching one day.
Wow. That would be great.
Wow.
I hope that doesn't get out to Sean, by the way. Don't let that out. I think
we can text now.
I hear it's a new thing.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, friends.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.